Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Three Fates Decide. My name is Sam, and I am doing another solo episode on the Murdaugh trial, the Alec Murdaugh trial. I know I did a solo a few weeks ago about the Netflix documentary, and I promised that I would come back and do one on the actual trial, so here I am. It just so happens that the week that I did the documentary solo episode was also the week that Alec Murdaugh was found guilty on all four charges and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences.
You think you know what we're going to talk about.
And welcome back to Three Fates Decide.
It just sounds more dramatic that way.
All right, so this week we are going to be talking about...
But just when you least expect it, we changed the game.
One Will Smith slapped Chris Rock.
I mean, we always celebrated Easter.
Harry Potter the Half-Blood Prince.
So we're going to do another free talk, freestyle thing, no planned discussion.
At the end of the day, only one thing matters. We decide.
But we're going to hit the main highlights.
That is the thing, like what we were saying back in that episode.
A quick recap.
Three Fates Decide podcast.
We're going to get into it from the very beginning. So, Alec Murdaugh was said to be the murderer of his wife, Maggie, who's 52, and his youngest son, Paul, who's 22, who were both shot dead at the family's 1,700-acre property in South Carolina on the night of June 7th, 2021. Murdaugh, when he spoke to police after the murder, said that he had returned home from visiting his elderly mother who had dementia, I believe, and he came home and he found the bodies and near the dog kennels and immediately called 911. There was audio of the 911 calls where he seemed to be completely devastated about this whole thing. No arrests were made on the murders for more than a year. And then in July of 2022, Alec was charged with the murders and was then convicted on March 2nd, 2023. So it really was a while before cops finally kind of looked at Alec. I personally believe that one of the reasons why it took so long for them to even look at Alec is because his family was so renowned in that area. They had owned a law firm for almost 100 years. Alec was an attorney at that law firm, and according to obviously the documentary that I mentioned, as well as a lot of people in the area, the Murdaughs kind of were able to get away with a lot. A lot of things kind of got swept under the rug because they had a lot of connections with police in the area and things like that. So the family very rarely got into trouble that they weren't able to get out of. So my personal opinion, that's why it took so long for Alec to get charged with the murders. So going into opening statements of the trial, which started on January 25th, the prosecutors were telling jurors that there was cell phone records and video taken by Paul minutes before he died that really proved Alec's guilt. The prosecutor's head attorney, Creighton Waters, gave a timeline for the murders, saying that Paul was shot at the dog kennels at about 8:50 p.m. and Maggie was only a few minutes later. Cell phone records placed Alec at the dog kennels minutes earlier, and then meanwhile the suspect had told everyone that he was never even at the kennels. Mr. Waters described the video that Paul had made at the kennels. He had made the video for his friend. They were dog sitting, so he was making a video for his friend to send to his friend, and that there was 3 voices in the video. One was Paul's, one was Maggie's, and one was Alec's. So they said basically it just proves that literally a few minutes, I believe the cell phone video was taken at 8:45, and apparently Paul had died about 8:50. So literally 5 minutes prior. That proves that Alec was there with Maggie and Paul 5 minutes prior. Meanwhile, he's saying he was visiting his mother. So, other evidence that the prosecution promised to show included gunshot residue found in both Alec's car, on him, and on a raincoat that he said that he had left at his parents' home a week after the murders. So then the Alec's defense team got up for their opening statements, and apparently during the opening statements, Alec was seen breaking down in tears. And his attorney, Dick Harpoonlin, described the fatal shot which killed his son, and I'm sorry for any trigger warnings here, but he said that it exploded his brain like a watermelon. Murdaugh arrived home to find his son's brains by his feet, and that Mr. Harpootland insisted that Alec was an innocent man, saying that the jurors will see a Snapchat of him and Paul happily spending some father-son bonding time about 2 hours prior to the murder, and that they'll see a Snapchat video of them riding around the area, looking at trees they planted and laughing and having a grand old time. And, that there was no way that Alec could possibly kill his son, the apple of his eye, when literally hours before they were great and having a great time. He also mentioned that the cell phone records that the prosecution had already discussed are incomplete, and that Maggie's phone was thrown on the side of the road half of a mile away from the family estate where the murders took place, at the same time that apparently Alec was already at the property. He said Alec would have had to have been Houdini to be in both places. So one thing that was discussed was that when Alec talked to police, he immediately suggested that his wife and son had been murdered because of the 2019 fatal boat crash that Paul was involved with that killed a young girl or a teenage girl. So if you recall, when we talked about the documentary, they spent a lot of time on that boat crash and about how Paul was charged and was awaiting trial for that death. So right away, Alec did suggest that, Paul had been getting death threats as a result of it and everything like that. So it had to be because of that. So they were saying that Alec, as soon as the first, law official arrived at the scene, who was Sheriff Sergeant Daniel Green, and on the body cam footage, it captures Alec, who was just pacing around. They said, like, almost like a dog, but there was no tears, no nothing, and he just kept asking, "Are they dead? Has someone gone to check them? Are you sure that they're dead?" and all that. And then the first thing that Alec told the officer when he arrived was that he was armed, saying that, because of the scene that he saw, he did go to the house and get a gun and bring it down here. And then Alec told the officers that the murders had to be connected to the boat crash that Paul was involved in. And he goes on to say that, his son was in a boat wreck a few months back, even though it had actually been years, but that he had been getting threats and that they didn't take it seriously. And, but again, just to refresh, he caused the death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach because he was drunk and driving his boat and crashed into a bridge. So that's what that is. And then on the tape, the body cam, he is not crying. There's absolutely zero tears. He's trying to build himself up to cry, but again, he's not crying. And so when they brought Sergeant Green to testify, he mentioned that he, even though he found his wife and son's bodies, though he seemed upset, he didn't have any physical tears running down his face. The body cam also showed that Murdaugh was wearing a clean shirt, even though he admitted to touching the bodies. Now, this was a very gruesome scene. Paul was, again, trigger warning, but Paul was shot on the side of the head and the neck with a shotgun. And then Maggie was shot multiple times with an AR-15 rifle. So this was a very gruesome scene. He said he touched both bodies, but yet he didn't have one speck of blood on him. He was dressed in a white t-shirt and dark shorts, and there was no sign of blood at all. And apparently multiple law enforcement officials described how Murdaugh was clean and didn't appear to have any blood on him when they arrived at the scene. Yet, according to the 911 call, he mentioned that he had touched the bodies and that he tried to turn over his son and check his wife for a pulse. So it just really didn't make a lot of sense considering all the blood that was kind of all over the place. They did play the 911 call that Murdaugh made on the night of the murders, and it's a very dramatic thing where he's apparently crying, he's sobbing on the phone, and he just kept saying, "It's bad, my wife and child have been shot badly." He also told the dispatcher about the 2019 boat crash involving Paul, so he was really pushing that narrative that it had all to do about that boat crash and that it was someone that was trying to get back at Paul for killing Miss Mallory Beach. Another narrative that Alec was pushing was to go and talk to a farmhand that was recently hired to work at the estate that they were staying in. He said that he's the only one that he could really think that was a little suspicious, because he had told Paul apparently this crazy story. And what the story is that when he was in high school, he got into a fight with some men of color, and FBI undercover teams observed him fighting them and put him on an undercover team with 3 Navy SEALs, and their job was to kill Black Panthers. And in case you don't know who Black Panthers were, they were a civil rights, group, mostly made of people of color. And so this guy was saying that he was hired by the FBI to go and kill Black Panthers. So he said that Alec mentioned that Paul was very taken aback when he heard that story and recorded it on his phone. And Alec also told officers that Paul had been working with him a lot and that the story was just really weird. But he also mentioned that he didn't believe that the man could be behind the murders and that it's just stupid and he was just embarrassed to even bring it up. But he wanted to put that little tidbit. He was pushing to just try and make sure that no one looked at him for the murder. So he was really like just finger pointing at everybody. So other evidence that the prosecution was bringing up was another audio from Alex's second interview with law enforcement that was played to the court on January 30th, revealing that he may have unwillingly slipped up and confessed to the murders of his wife and son. He apparently was sobbing and said, "I did him so bad," which appeared to say that he was talking about his son in the police interview. SLED Special Agent Jeff Croft, just to remind you, SLED is South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, was asked by the prosecution to clarify what he heard Alex say, and Jeff Croft mentioned he just said, "It's just so bad, I did him so bad." So, it does appear that he may have slipped up there. Prosecutors sought to request that Alec had slipped up during the police interview, and Murdaugh was seen shaking his head and was appearing to mouth, "I did not say that," to his attorneys in court. However, the audio of the interview raised doubts of whether or not Alec said "I" or "they." So it just, I guess, because audio sometimes can be a little crazy. So there are some people who think he said "they did him so bad," not "I did him so bad." During cross-examination, another defense attorney, Griffin, grilled Agent Croft as to why, if Alec's statement raised any alarm bells, he didn't follow up on it. and the special agent testified that he made a mental note about the comment and said that it was still early on in the investigation when officials were in more of an information gathering stage. The audio was played again in court twice in real time and once at 1/3 speed. When asked by the defense if he heard they, not I, when the recording was slowed down, Agent Croft said he still heard him say I. I do kind of get the defense's point because, if I heard that, I definitely would have made sure that that was, pushed. The fact that it took so long for them to even charge Alec, and this guy saying that Alec may have slipped up and said I in his second interview, which was probably not long after the murders, and nothing happened. I mean, that does make it look suspicious. Other evidence that Agent Croft was talked about with his body cam footage on January 30th, it revealed that the Murdaughs had a huge stash of firearms inside the home. And he told them how he seized firearms and ammunition from the Murdaugh home, including weapons and ammo that matched the type of guns and bullets that were used to kill Maggie and Paul. A .300 blackout semi-automatic rifle, a 12-gauge Browning shotgun, a Benelli shotgun, a 12-gauge pump shotgun were all seized from the family home and were brought into the courtroom to be shown to the jurors. The agent also testified that there were several empty boxes of ammunition, and which were found during the search of the home on January 8th June 8th and June 13th. Inside the blackout rifle was cellular and Bellet .300 AAC BLK ammo, which is the same type of ammo that was used to kill Maggie. And also seized as evidence was a credit card receipt that showed that there was purchase from Gucci over $1,000, and that item had been circled. So possible motive, that maybe Maggie was spending too much money. I don't know. On January 31st, Agent Croft also testified that the ammunition, steel shot ammo specifically for a Winchester dry lock matching the fatal shot fired through Paul's brain, had been located on the Murdaugh family property. Two separate guns, a rifle and a shotgun, were used to kill Maggie and Paul. They've never found the actual guns. They just found guns that share similar ammo, which I guess prosecution felt that that was enough proof since they were never able to actually find the murder weapons. Because there was two different guns used in these murders, the defense team sought to push a theory that there could have been two shooters that were working separately and responsible for killing both Maggie and Paul. Jurors were shown photos and diagrams of the crime scene from both the night of the murders and a month after the murders on July 16th, with Mr. Harpootlian honing in on two bullet projectiles in particular, one that traveled through the doghouse and one through the quail pen. Under cross-examination of another SLED agent, Melinda Worley, Mr. Harpootlian pushed the idea that it could have possibly been two people because everything, or the projected shots were from two different angles, and that it was reasonably possible that that was that is what happened. Agent Worley did admit that the theory is possible, but said that it is only one explanation as to what may have taken place on that night. She also added that angles could also be explained as one shooter moving around. So, I mean, is it possible? Yes, which technically the defense only has to create that little bit of doubt in the juror's mind, and that's what they were doing. Jurors also learned about the final text messages and phone calls made by Paul and Maggie before their murders. On the night of June 7th, 2021, Paul placed a call on his cell phone to a friend, Rogan Gibson, at 8:40, lasting 4 minutes, followed by a second call at 8:44. The second was the last incoming communication Mr. Gibson received from Paul. 5 minutes later, at 8:49, Mr. Gibson sent Paul a message. See if you can get a good picture of it. Marion wants to send it to a girl we know that's a vet. Get him to sit and stay. He shouldn't move around too much. The message, which they believe is about a dog that Paul was taking care of, went unanswered. From that point on, neither Paul nor his mother responded to any messages or calls on their cell phones. Prosecutors said that in their opening statements that Paul was shot dead first about 8:50 and Maggie minutes later. Their cell phones had no activity from 8:49 onward. After sending the text message at 8:49 and receiving no response from his friend, Mr. Gibson sent a follow-up text at 9:58, which just said, yo, trying to get his friend's attention. Mr. Gibson also tried calling Paul multiple times at 9:10, 9:29, 9:42, 9:57, 10:08, but kept getting no responses. Jurors also heard that he also texted Paul's mother Maggie at 9:34 saying, tell Paul to call me. Shortly after, Mr. Gibson had 4 missed calls from Alec Murdaugh at 10:21, 10:24, 10:25, and 10:30. So that I can't even imagine. Like, you literally were just having a conversation with your friend and then all of a sudden he just disappeared and then you find out what happened. But going back to the cross-examination of Agent Worley, Mr. Harpootlian sought to pick holes in the evidence gathered from the crime scene. He raised doubts about a mark or a potential footprint spotted on Maggie's calf on the night of the murders. He suggested that a footwear impression that Agent Worley said she couldn't say was a mark, but that it could be a footwear impression. It could just be a mark. She couldn't tell, I guess, at that time what it was. The mark was not examined on the scene, and there was no impression of the imprint that was taken, is what she testified to. She also confirmed that the bloody footprint found on the feeding room was later determined to be that of a law enforcement officer. Something that the defense's line of questioning made that, obviously the scene wasn't preserved and that, evidence could have technically been destroyed because they were kind of walking around, stepping in the blood and all that stuff. So they definitely were doing a good job of picking holes in that aspect because they definitely police should have done better with such a horrific crime scene. Like, you need to be careful. I think anyone that's seen any type of cop show knows, like, you need to make sure that you preserve that crime scene as best as possible. So one surprising testimony on January 31st was Alec's cousin, John Bedingfield, who testified against him, revealing that he had actually bought Alec several firearms and gave to him years prior to the murders, and that they matched the type that were used to kill Maggie. John Bedingfield works for the Department of Natural Resources, but has a side business making and selling firearms under a federal license. And he told the court that Alec approached him before Christmas in 2016, wanting to buy both Paul and his surviving son rifles as presents. He purchased 2 Subsonic 300 blackout rifles, one black, one tan in color, and it was about $9,188 so that his sons could hunt hogs. 2 years later, April 2018, he said that Alec also bought a third rifle for him for $875 because he said Paul had lost his other one. So his own cousin testified against him, saying that he sold him rifles that match what killed his wife. So the prosecution was basically trying to prove that Alec had kind of set this whole thing up, including the fact that he had texted and called his wife after the murders had been done. So apparently his final text to his wife was moments after he allegedly killed his wife and son, and it was revealed to the court during the case. Jurors were shown data from the cell phones of all 3, Maggie, Paul, and Alec, on the night of the murders. Prosecutors say that Alec shot Paul again at around 8:50 and Maggie a few minutes later. Almost immediately after, cell phone data shows that Alec made several calls to Maggie and other family members. His first call to Maggie was at 9:04, minutes after she was already killed, and it went straight to voicemail. He then texted her at 9:08 claiming he was going to visit his mother, saying, "I'm going to check on M, be right back," and the text was never read. In total, Murdaugh called his wife 5 times between 9:04 and 10:03 after he supposedly killed her. None of the calls were answered. His last text message to his wife came at 9:47, where he just said, "Call me, babe." As well as calling Maggie, Murdaugh also, his cell phone records also showed that he made several calls to other numbers in the hours between the time prosecutors say the murder took place and he called 911. Prosecutors allege that he was seeking to build an alibi for that night. Minutes after the final call, Murdaugh called 911 at 10:07, claiming that he found Maggie and Paul's body. What is interesting, and again, we live in this great time of technology, is that they were able, computer crimes, center, Lieutenant Britt Dove testified that he processed all 3 cell phones the night, with the night of the murders. And based on the cell phone data, he said that the last text message Maggie read was a message from her sister-in-law, Lynn Murdaugh, in a group chat, which she read at 8:49. After 8:49, she didn't open or respond to any messages or calls from several people, including her husband, her oldest son, and Alec's brother, John Marvin Murdaugh. Jurors also heard how the cell phone data shows Maggie's phone orientation changed from portrait to landscape at 8:54 and then again at 9:06, indicating that it was in someone's hands. A minute later, at 9:07, the screen went on and off as though someone tried but failed to unlock it. Health app data also presented jurors showing that Maggie's cell phone recorded 59 steps in 2 minutes after 8:53 p.m., after prosecutors alleged Maggie and Paul were already dead. So they basically proved that someone was holding the phone and took steps and recorded those steps. Maggie's phone was locked between 8:49 on June 7th, 2021 and 1:10 p.m. the following day, when it was found dumped on the side of the road around a quarter of a mile from the house. Paul's cell phone was also initially locked after the murders until a Secret Service digital forensics examiner, John Van Houten, who testified that he managed to unlock it when he successfully tried Paul's birthday as the password. But they basically showed that, someone was walking around and moving with Maggie's phone. So now the big evidence that I think really was kind of like a turning point for the prosecution is that on February 1st, jurors were shown a cell phone footage taken by Paul at the dog kennel just minutes before he and Maggie were killed. And it basically casted a bunch of doubts on Alex's alibi. Off camera, 3 voices are heard: Paul, Maggie, and a man prosecutors say is Alec. In very dramatic testimony, 2 friends of Paul who had close ties to the family, who've known the family for a long time, both said that they were 100% sure that the voice belonged to Alec. Cell phone data also showed that the video was recorded for 58 seconds from 8:44 and 49 seconds to 8:45, 47 seconds, less than 5 minutes before the murders. The attorney, Alec claimed that he was napping at the family home at the time. So this, again, disproves his alibi. Rogan Gibson, who is the one that actually was getting sent the video, described the Murdaugh as a second family, and he was one of the ones that testified that he was 100% sure that it's Alex's voice in the footage. And then the other was another friend, Will Loving. The video was played in court, and Murdaugh appeared to rock his head up and down and cry because at that point he knew that he was caught. Another video that was shown was a Snapchat video Paul had sent Mr. Loving less than 1 hour before he and Maggie were killed. The video was sent at 7:56 p.m. on June 7th, 2021, and it shows Alec on the grounds of the family estate. In the footage, Alec was seen dressed in trousers, loafers, and a blue button-down shirt. And that's clothing that did not match what he was wearing during the police cam footage after the murders. In the body cam footage shown in court, the Alec was dressed in a white short-sleeved t-shirt and shorts, so definitely a change of clothing. Questions had already been raised about his outfit, as multiple law enforcement officials had testified that Murdaugh's clothes were clean from head to toe, even though, again, he mentioned that he had touched both bodies. But again, that could just be, a coincidence. Do I believe in coincidences? Not really. Um, it's still not really known if investigators ever found the first outfit of him in the trousers and the blue shirt. But less than an hour from that Snapchat, Paul and Maggie were unfortunately killed. Prosecutors then claimed that Paul was, again, I know I've said this a couple of times, but that he was killed about 8:50 p.m., followed by Maggie. Cell phone data being used to narrow down the murders to the precise 8-second window. Britt Dove, the SLED agent, testified that Paul's last activity was at 8:48 p.m. and that Maggie's was 8:49 p.m. 8 seconds later, Paul received a text message, but it went unread. Neither Maggie nor Paul used their cell phones after that time. I'm sorry, just to clarify, Paul's last activity was 8:48 and 59 seconds, and Maggie's was 8:49, 27 seconds. And then that 8 seconds later was 8:49, 35 seconds. So it was a very quick thing. So as mentioned before, Alec made several calls to his wife, but jurors heard testimony that Murdaugh, the night of the murders, again, made those calls, but they were mysteriously deleted from his call log. Lieutenant Dove testified that Mr. Murdaugh had called Maggie 5 times between 9:04 and 10:03 p.m. that night, and none of the calls were answered. But according to the call log on his cell phone, Murdaugh didn't place or receive any calls between 4:35 p.m. on June 4th and 10:25 p.m. on June 7th. Lieutenant Dove processed 3 cell phones belonging to Murdaugh, Maggie, and Paul, and testified that the trove of the phone calls from Mr. Murdaugh made to his wife's cell phone was missing from his call log. The only explanation for the missing data is that the call logs were manually and intentionally deleted by someone between June 7th and when his phone was seized by authorities in September of 2021. So why did he delete them? I don't know. That's pretty stupid because that just makes you look even more guilty. When the defense did cross-examination of Lieutenant Dove, their goal was to cast doubt on the theory that Murdaugh took Maggie's phone. Lieutenant Dove did admit that the data suggested Maggie and Murdaugh's phones were not in the same place at the same time at 9:06, as the step data did not match, which was important because at 9:06 is when the final orientation changed. And remember, they said that it went to the portrait mode and then back. So that is a very important detail. Lieutenant Dove did testify that this movement could have been as it was being thrown from the vehicle or where it was discovered the next day, and the defense contending that Murdaugh was at the family property walking with his cell phone at that time. However, under redirect, prosecutors casted doubt on the defense's time frame for when the phone was tossed down the road, and Lieutenant Dove did testify that the orientation change can only take place when the phone screen is on. The SLED agent testified that the screen on Maggie's phone was off between 9:07 p.m. and 9:31 p.m. So if the phone was thrown from the car during that time, there would have been no orientation change ever recorded. So it was definitely on at the time that it was possibly thrown, if that's what they're going with. So in early February, the 2nd and 3rd, several witnesses testified without the jury being present as the judge weighed in on whether or not the evidence could be presented at the trial. The prosecution claimed that Murdaugh's alleged financial crimes are possible motive, while the defense asked the judge to throw that evidence out. On February 7th, the judge ruled that in the state's favor that the evidence about his financial crimes are admissible in court, and that was a huge blow to the defense and basically provided a huge motive in this case. At the time of the murders, Alex's law firm, PMPED, was closing in on his apparent alleged multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, with a colleague confronting him about it on the morning of the killings. His finances were also coming under intense scrutiny in the lawsuit brought by the family of Mallory Beach, who again is the young 19-year-old who was killed in the boating accident with Paul. The hearing for the boat crash lawsuit was scheduled for a week after the murders, but obviously it was postponed because of the murders. But separate from his murder trial, Alec also is facing around 100 charges for stealing almost $8.5 million from the law firm clients dating back to 2011. The attorney, who has since been disbarred, represented the clients in wrongful death lawsuits before allegedly pocketing the settlement money for himself. And I'm sure they'll go, we'll go into this a little bit later, but he did have a huge opioid addiction. So I do believe that that's why he was stealing so much money, was so that he could keep up with his addiction, which, but Alex's former best friend of 40 years broke down in tears in court as he described the moment he learned that Alec had stolen millions of dollars from his clients, and also $192,000 from him as well. The friend's name is Chris Wilson, and he said that the betrayal just knocked him down and revealed that he didn't know what to think anymore, and that he had known and loved this man most of his life, and he just couldn't believe that he could do something like that. He also testified that two other attorneys that worked on the case, that he had worked with Alec on a case together, and Murdaugh made $792,000 for his cut. At Alex's request, Mr. Wilson made the check payable directly to him instead of the law firm. In July of 2021, a month after the murders, Mr. Wilson said that his friend had gotten in touch saying that he had been unable to structure the fees as planned and needed to pay the money back and have it paid directly to the law firm. Alec also only had $600,000 to pay it back. And Wilson said that he covered the additional $192,000 on the basis that Murdaugh would eventually pay him back. On September 3rd of 2021, 3 months after the murders, Mr. Wilson said that he finally learned that his friend had been scamming him and a bunch of other people and confronted him the next day. He revealed that his longtime friend broke down and confessed to stealing the money to fund his secret 20-year opioid addiction. And I don't even know. The CFO of the law firm, Jeannie Seckling, also testified and revealed that she confronted Alec over the missing payments on the day that Maggie and Paul were killed. She told the court that by June 7th of 2021, the law firm partners had noticed $792,000 worth of legal fees were missing from the case that he worked on with Mr. Wilson. When she approached Alex to ask him about it that morning, she said he gave her a dirty look, something that she said she had never received from him before. And hours later, Maggie and Paul were killed. Over the next several months, the law firm partners uncovered multi-million-dollar fraud scheme where he had been stealing millions from their clients and pocketed himself, reaching the head of the confrontation, and eventually he resigned on September 3rd. The day after he was forced to resign, amazingly enough, Alec was shot in the head on the side of the road, but prosecutors feel that it was a botched hitman plot, which is very interesting. So on September 4th, 2021, news broke out that Alec had been shot in Hampton County, South Carolina. It was said that he was changing a tire and was shot in the head. His attorney had confirmed, but he was still conscious and talking, and it was a good sign. An unidentified Good Samaritan reportedly drove him to an ambulance, and the EMTs began treatment and called the helicopter to airlift him to the hospital. There was an entry and exit wound, a skull fracture, and minor brain bleeding in 2 places. A SLED spokesman had said that the agents were actively investigating the incident when this all came about and that it was considered an attempted murder. 2 days later, Alec, whose wounds were superficial, released a statement saying that he was leaving his job and entering treatment once he left the hospital. His statement said, "The murders of my wife and son have caused an incredibly difficult time in my life. I have made a lot of decisions that I truly regret. I'm resigning from my law firm and entering rehab after a long battle that has been exacerbated by these murders. I am immensely sorry to everyone I've hurt, including my family, friends, and colleagues. I ask for prayers as I rehabilitate myself and my relationships." By the 15th of September, there was a surprising break in the case of Alex's shootings. Authorities alleged that he attempted to arrange his shooting death for his surviving son, Buster, to receive $10 million in life insurance. Curtis Edward Smith, the man that Alex had allegedly hired to kill him, was arrested in South Carolina on the 15th and charged with assisted suicide, assault, and battery of a highly aggravated nature, pointing and presenting a firearm, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. According to the arrest affidavit, Alec conspired with Smith, who was 61 at the time, in a scheme to shoot him. He allegedly provided Smith with a firearm and directed him to shoot him in the head. Alec admitted to the scheme on September 13th, and Smith admitted to his role the day after. Alec said that his addiction to opioids and his depression after the murders of his wife and son drove him to concoct this scheme. Alec knew, his attorney mentioned that obviously he knew what he did was wrong and that he was a massive depressive and was going through withdrawal and all that stuff. But he said that he wanted the money to go to his oldest son to help him out, and it was to protect his child. Later on September 15th, when everything was kind of coming out, Alec's attorneys claimed that Smith had exploited Alec's drug addiction and mental illness. So that is what forced Alec to want to end his life, which is crazy. On the 16th, Alec was pulled over by the Hampton County Law Enforcement Center. I'm sorry, he went to the Hampton County Law Enforcement Center and turned himself in because there was a warrant for his arrest, because obviously this was a planned thing. Soon after, SLED announced that they had arrested him in connection to a shooting on the incident of September 4th, in which he conspired with Curtis Edward Smith to assist him in committing suicide for the explicit purpose of allowing beneficiary to collect life insurance. Alec was charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and filing a false police report. And yeah, that was the craziness of him trying to commit suicide. Now, was it really to just give Buster insurance money? I think it was also because he knew that eventually the police were going to get to him for the murders of his wife and son. But again, that's just my personal opinion. Plus, obviously, all the financial woes that he was dealing with work finding out about it. And then on top of it, the son of his ex-housekeeper accused him of stealing $4 million after her mysterious death. Now, if you recall, I believe I mentioned in the documentary episode that his housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, had worked for the family for like more than 20 years, and she mysteriously died after a trip and fall down the stairs of the family home in 2018. And there was misconceptions as to how it happened. Murdaugh mentioned that he arrived after and she was still kind of conscious, and she mentioned that the dogs had pushed her down the stairs and whatever, but then it turned out that Alec actually wasn't even there. And, so it was just a very suspicious thing, and a lot of people seem to think that someone in the family, not necessarily Alec, but someone in the family had caused her death. There was also speculation in the documentary that she found Alec's stash of opioids under his bed, and then informed Paul, and Paul confronted his father. So, you know, it was kind of crazy. But what Alec did was he he fought with his insurance because it was an accident at the home, and he did it so that her family could get money. Her son told the court with this whole trial that he swindled them out of $4 million in a wrongful death lawsuit payout from the family after his mother's death. The court has shown evidence of two separate settlements in the wrongful death suit, one for $505,000 and one for $3.8 million. Mr. Satterfield testified that Alec did not tell him about the settlements and that he did not receive 1 cent of the money. In June of 2021, the same month that Maggie and Paul were shot, there were reports in the media about the settlement, and Mr. Satterfield had chased Alec about the progress of the case. But unbeknownst to him, Murdaugh had already allegedly received the payouts and pocketed the money for himself. So now Murdaugh is also charged with almost 30 criminal charges over just the Satterfield settlement alone. Prosecutor Mr. Waters also hinted on an ongoing uncertainty about the nature of her death, which I already discussed, and how she fell. So that is even more issues in terms of his finances. Another witness that the prosecution brought on was attorney Mark Tinsley, who is the attorney for the Beach family, the family of Mallory Beach, and basically how it was putting his finances under increased certainty at the time of the murders. So again, kind of still going into the motive of these murders. Mr. Tinsley told the court that Murdaugh claimed that he was broke and couldn't pay the settlement that Tinsley was asking for his clients. Tinsley didn't believe it, so he filed a motion compelling Murdaugh to reveal his finances. After hearing of the suit had been scheduled to take place on June 10th of 2021, Mr. Tinsley then testified that he expected to take the lawsuit to trial in the late summer of 2021, but obviously everything got derailed because of the murders. He said at that point a fuse had been lit and it was going to expose Murdaugh of all his financial crimes. So he, I guess, tried to figure out a way to get out of that situation by making him a victim of unspeakable tragedy. And Tinsley said that pretty quickly he recognized that the case against Alec, if he were in fact the victim of some vigilante, it would have been over. So I think Mr. Tinsley was definitely suspect of that whole thing. So he basically is saying that Murdaugh knew everything was going to unravel, and that is possibly why he decided to kill his son and his wife. So as I mentioned, one of the other witnesses was the caretaker of his mother. Her name is Michelle Shelley Smith, and she worked for Murdaugh's mother from October 2019. And she told the jurors that Mr. Murdaugh had very unusual behavior both on the night of the murders and the days that followed. She said that he was very fidgety when he showed up that night, and he showed up between 8:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. and then left 20 minutes later. So I believe Alec had said he was there for a while, but she said he was only there for 20 minutes. And she testified that it was very unusual for him to visit at night and that he was just very, very fidgety. A few days after the murders, she said that he spoke to her about his visit that night, telling her to tell authorities that he had stayed at his parents' house for double the length of time that he had. And he said that she said that he told her that he was there for 30 to 40 minutes. And the conversation just kind of made her really nervous. And so she called her brother, who's a police officer, to tell him what Alec had said to her. After that initial conversation, Alec spoke to her again, this time offering to help her out with paying for her upcoming wedding and putting in a good word for her with other jobs, and basically trying to bribe her. And she broke down in tears when she described that Alec and his family was a good family, and told the jurors under cross-examination that she believes that his offers were simply him being a good person. But I think it's pretty clear that he was trying to bribe her. Days after he offered to help pay for the wedding expenses, Miss Smith testified that Murdaugh showed up at his mother's house at 6:30 a.m. In the morning, cradling a blue something. She didn't know what it was. She said he took it upstairs and left it before he left again. And she noticed for the first time that he had a cut or a bruise on his forehead. He returned sometime later that day, driving a white truck, which he then left at the property and switched it to a black truck. The prosecutor said that law enforcement found a blue tarp and a blue rain jacket in a search of the home, and they said that gunshot residue was found on the jacket. Under cross-examination, Miss Smith insisted that the item she saw him carrying was a blue tarp, not a blue rain jacket. But under redirect, she was shown a photo of the bundled up blue item and asked if that was what she had seen, and she confirmed it was. Mr. Water, the prosecutor, said that that was actually the rain jacket all bundled up. And the judge denied a motion from the defense to strike the raincoat as evidence. But there was gunshot residue found all over the mysterious blue raincoat that Alec had allegedly hid in his parents' home in the days after the murders. A sled forensic scientist, Megan Fletcher, testified that at least 38 gunshot residue particles were found on the inside of the jacket, which is a significant number and is consistent with a recently fired gun being wrapped up inside the jacket. She also added that she stopped counting after she reached 38, but said that she definitely knows she would have found more. A smaller number was also found on the outside. The two firearms used in the murders was an AR-15 style rifle and a shotgun. And again, those have never been found. Alec's hands, his shirt and shorts, and the seatbelt buckle of his car also had a small number of gunshot residue particles on them. On his shoes, though, there was none found. So, if you recall when we were talking about Paul's video inside the kennels, that two people had said they were 100% sure that it was definitely Alec's voice that was in that video. One other person also said that he was 100% sure that the voice captured on the video was Alec's, and that is his friend Ronnie Crosby, who is a partner at the law firm and a friend of Alec's for like 25 years. He testified that he rushed to Moselle as soon as he learned about the murders and stayed with Alec until about 3:30 in the morning. He said that during that night he had multiple conversations with Alec about what he was doing that night, and that Alec had personally told him that he never went down to the kennels that night. And, instead he gave him the same alibi story that he gave law enforcement, that he was napping in the home, woke up, drove to his parents' house to visit his mother. Mr. Crosby also testified that he learned that Alec had been stealing millions of dollars from the law firm clients, and that he probed into the missing payments was put on hold. I'm sorry, that the probe into the missing payments was put on hold because of the murder. So a lot of things kind of going into what this motive is and why he may have done what he did. Another way prosecutors were trying to find holes in the alibi was data taken from Alex's car, and it offered a potential timeline for his movements on the night of the murders and suggests a whole bunch of holes between that and obviously what his mother's caregiver said. FBI electronics engineer Dwight Fox, I can't even say his last name, so I'm not going to. He testified that he extracted data from the onboard computer system of his 2021 Chevrolet Suburban, including call logs, contact lists, some location data, and the state of the vehicle in terms of when it was turned on, when it was in and out of park mode, and when the doors were opened, which is crazy that that's what we could do these days. So this basically gave the jurors an idea as to what Alec's movements were that night. It indicated that Alec did leave the family home and drove to visit his sick mother around 9:06 p.m. and arrived at 9:22. However, it also indicates that he only stayed at his parents' house for 21 minutes and not the 30 to 40 minutes he told Miss Smith to tell authorities, leaving again at 9:43 p.m. Records show him arriving at Moselle around 10 p.m. and he called 911 at 10:07 p.m. Alec's previous or ex-friend, Mr. Wilson, did testify a second time, and he did make mention that he had spoken to Murdaugh on the night of the murders, and records did show that Alec did call Mr. Wilson at 9:11 on the night of the 7th of June, and that Mr. Wilson had asked Alec if he could call him back because he was busy, and that Alec seemed completely normal at the time. Then call records showed that Mr. Wilson called Alec back at 9:20, and Murdaugh said he was just getting to his mother's house. At 9:52 p.m., Murdaugh had sent him a text saying, "Call me if you're up." Mr. Wilson said he called him right away. The first time there was no answer, so he called a second time, and Alec answered, and they had a brief chat about Murdaugh's mother. Prosecutors say that Murdaugh killed his wife and son again around 8:50, so here he was an hour later acting completely normal. Prosecutors also interviewed the current housekeeper. Her name was Blanca Simpson, and she worked with as the family housekeeper for several years, and she had said that Mr. Murdaugh had asked her to come to Moselle on June 8th, 2021, hours after the murders, to make the house, quote unquote, the way Maggie liked it. She said when she went to the house, she noticed several unusual things, including pots being in the fridge instead of on the stove or sink. Maggie's pajamas and underwear were laying in a neat pile in the middle of the doorway of the laundry room. Just very unusual things. And she said it just didn't look right to her because apparently Maggie didn't wear underwear with her pajamas and they appeared to be clean and not dirty. In the shower room, she said she noticed a light puddle of water, a towel, and a pair of khaki pants. On the morning of June 7th, she told the court that she had seen Alec wearing a pair of khaki pants. She testified that she put the pants in the wash. Ms. Simpson also testified about the full outfit she saw Murdaugh wearing on the morning of the murders: khaki pants, seafoam polo shirt, a blue sports coat, and some house shoes. As the person who cleaned all of the Murdaugh's clothing, she revealed that she never saw the seafoam colored shirt or the house shoes ever again after the day of the murders. 2 months after the murders, in August of 2021, she testified that Murdaugh had brought up what shirt he was wearing on the morning of the murders. The two of them were at one of the Murdaugh's properties, and he told her, "I need to talk to you, come and sit down." And she just had a really bad feeling, and she was kind of nervous, and he mentioned that there's a video and said, "You remember the Vinnie Vine shirt I was wearing that day?" And Miss Simpson said she believed that he was trying to make sure she told law enforcement the same story about what he was wearing the day of the murders. I'm telling you, this whole family has been slick their whole lives, getting out of trouble and stuff. So it doesn't surprise me that he was doing all this. Jurors also heard about phone calls and text messages between Miss Simpson and Maggie, revealing that Alec had insisted both Maggie and Paul come to the property at Moselle on the day of the murders. Miss Simpson told the court that Maggie texted her saying, "Alec wants me to come home." Maggie liked being at the family home beach house in Edisto and had been preparing to host a big 4th of July gathering there, so she didn't really want to come home. But in a phone conversation, Maggie also mentioned that Alec wanted her to come to Moselle that day, and she seemed a bit disappointed about it. She sounded like she didn't want to come home. She was just upset about it. But Alec had also asked Paul to come too because he wanted his son to fix something on the property, according to Miss Simpson. Prior to the murder, Maggie had confided to Miss Simpson about concerns with the family's finances and the concerns that Murdaugh was not being truthful with her about the extent of their situation. Miss Simpson said that when she spoke about everything with Maggie, Maggie had broke down crying. She was concerned about the amount of money they were requesting on the lawsuit, which was $30 million. She also mentioned that Maggie told her she felt like Alec wasn't being truthful, and Under cross-examination, though, Miss Simpson told the court that she got the impression that Alec adored his wife, but Miss Simpson damningly became the fourth witness to identify Murdaugh's voice in the video with the dog kennels moments before the murders. So, did he adore his wife, or is he just an actor? So going into the actual murders, forensic pathologist Dr. Ellen Reimer testified to the extent of the injury suffered by both Maggie and Paul. She said that she performed the autopsies and revealed that Paul was likely standing with his face tilted toward the killer when he was shot. The first bullet to the chest likely left him standing, but the second bullet blew the inside of his head, leaving almost all of his brain matter detached from his body. Dr. Reimer said that the stippling that was found on Paul's chest wound indicating the shot was fired from within 3 feet, but not closer than 6 inches. There was no soot, which would indicate a closer shot. Maggie was also facing her killer when she was first shot, the expert said. She suffered a gunshot wound to her left breast, and the bullet traveled upward to the left side of her face. The second shot went through her kidney, which probably caused her to bend over. While in that position, she was shot in the chest and the back of the head. Cameras in the courtroom were requested not to show the graphic autopsy pictures, but somehow I do believe that they were leaked after the case, which is just disgusting. Maggie's sister did testify on February 14th, and it was revealed that her brother-in-law Alec had made weird comments after the murders. She mentioned that one time he mentioned he didn't know anybody that would have did this, but definitely that the killer had planned the murders for a long time. He could just tell, I guess, by how everything was. Also mentioned that Alec was more eager to clear Paul's name of the boat crash than finding who murdered Maggie and Paul, which she thought was weird. She also revealed that Maggie discovered that her sister and her husband had an affair. And in the absence of the jury, Ms. Proctor claimed that although the affair had happened 15 years ago and they were able to work through it, it was still a sore point in the marriage, and that Maggie had brought it up again around the time of the murders. So the defense denied the affair and asked the judge to disregard the testimony, and the judge agreed. So the jury did not hear that part. Another witness was the dog caretaker, Dale Davis, who, usually cared for the dogs at the kennels, and he mentioned that the puddles of water were not where they should have been, and the hose had clearly been used, and the dogs were all in the wrong kennels when the police arrived on scene. The prosecutor suggested that Murdaugh cleaned up himself and the crime scene after the murders before building the alibi. Under cross-examination, Mr. Davis confirmed that the hose was already in a different position to where he had left it on the cell phone video captured by Paul. He also recounted a time when Murdaugh couldn't bring himself to put a dog down. So I guess they were trying to just get sympathy. The prosecution then showed video footage of a police interview with Alec Murdaugh on August 11th, 2021. In the interview, which had never been seen before, SLED Special Agent David Owen confronted Murdaugh about the inconsistencies with his alibi from his interview 2 months before. Among the inconsistencies were how long Murdaugh spent at his mother's home that night, whether or not he went to the dog kennels, the different clothes he was wearing, the timeline of when he was at his law firm, and the reason why Maggie had gone to the family estate that day. Alec denied that it was his voice on Paul's cell phone, even though multiple witnesses had said it is. In the police interview, it also showed that Murdaugh claimed he had spent 45 minutes to an hour at his sick mother's house that night, which obviously had been proven wrong. Alec also claimed that he wasn't expecting his wife home, but that she was there because she was worried about him. But obviously, again, we had learned that that's not the truth, that Miss Simpson had testified that Maggie had said that Alec wanted her and Paul to come to the house that night. So it was several inconsistencies within a matter of time. The footage also showed that Alec didn't have any surprise when he was told for the very first time that most likely his wife and son had been murdered by the family's own guns. Near the end of the police interview, the agent was seen telling Murdaugh that he has a few more questions, and then the bombshell moment, the officer asked Murdaugh for the first time if he had killed his wife and son. He legit just asked, like, did you kill Maggie? And Alec replied, no, I did not kill my wife. And then the agent asked if he knows who did, and he said, no, I don't know who did. Then that's when Alec pretty much realized that he was the prime suspect, and he legit just asked, like, am I a suspect in this case? Upon cross-examination, the defense pretty much wanted to know why at that point Alec was the prime suspect, and they mentioned that around that time Alec was spending about $50,000 a week on drugs, and that Mr. Smith, who was Alex's alleged drug dealer, distant cousin, former law firm client, co-conspirator in the botched hitman plot, owed money to a local gang or whatever, and wanted to know why the members of this gang were never treated as suspects, and why their DNA wasn't tested, and why no evidence was taken from the crime scene to see if it was because they did it. But the agent testified that by August 2021, Murdaugh was the one and only suspect in the killings. As a result of the cross-examination, which hurt the defense, it actually led the judge to reverse a ruling, and it allowed the jurors to hear the testimony about the hitman plot and potentially actually hearing from Mr. Smith, who was known as Cousin Eddie. And they kind of really went into that whole thing, which we already talked about. Then a crime scene expert came in and talked about how and again, this is very graphic, so I apologize, but really walking the jurors through the victim's final moments, and including the gunshots that they suffered and where the gunman stood while firing each shot. And basically it was revealed that the killer ambushed Paul in the feeding room of the dog kennel and left him with no time to defend himself. The first shot, which struck Paul in the chest and arm, was not fatal, and he remained standing for several moments and then moved slowly towards the door of the feeding room, towards the killer. As he reached the door frame, he was shot a second time in the shoulder and brain and fell forward, landing outside the feeding room. After killing Paul, the gunman left the feeding room area and approached Maggie outside. In her final moments, she faced her killer and backed away, knocking into the family's ATV before being gunned down by the killer. She was struck twice before falling to her knees, at which point the killer shot her twice in the head. Again, jurors were shown photos, and also photos of a tire impression on the back of Maggie's calf, which the expert said was from the tire of the ATV under the hangar next to where Maggie's body was found. So going back to the car data, it actually placed Alec Murdaugh at the spot where his wife's phone was later found dumped, before he quickly sped away from the scene. General Motors had contacted law enforcement to hand over a trove of data from the 2021 Chevy Suburban, including never-before-seen speed and GPS data, days after an agent testified about the data in the car. So, GM stepped up. It shows that Mr. Murdaugh left the family home in his 2021 Chevy Suburban at 9:07 p.m. on the night of June 7th, just minutes after he allegedly killed Maggie and Paul. A minute later, while driving down the road at the speed of 42 miles per hour, his car passed the very spot along the road where Maggie's cell phone was recovered from the shrubbery the next day. After passing that spot, his car then picked up speed, reaching 52 miles per hour just 1 minute later at 9:09 p.m. and continuing to go at a high speed all the way to his mother's house. Another big crack in Murdaugh's alibi was that data revealed that less than 20 seconds passed between the moment Alex's car arrived at the dog kennel and the start of his 911 call where he claimed to have found Maggie and Paul's body. During the 911 call and in interviews Murdaugh gave in the aftermath of the murders, he claimed that he had touched both the bodies and checked for signs of life before calling 911. He also claimed that he moved Paul and his cell phone popped out of his pocket and he picked it up and put it back down on his son. The data showed that Murdaugh's car arrived at the dog kennels at 10:05 and 57 seconds at that night, and that he made the call at 10:06 and 14 seconds, just 17 seconds after his car pulled into the kennels. So unless he's Superman and could run that quickly, I don't see how that is remotely possible. Another thing that they're putting toward motive is that apparently Paul and Maggie found bags of pills a month before the murders, and that Maggie was supposedly searching the internet to try and find out what each pill was. On June 3rd, 4 days before the murders, Alec had sent a voicemail to a bank CEO asking him for money. And he said that he needed to extend his farm credit line another $600,000, and mentioned that his dad will sign also if needed, and asked how much turnaround it would take. So he was looking for some major moolah. Taking the stand on his father's defense, which I mentioned before, is Buster, who is the oldest son. He mentioned that his father had been completely destroyed and heartbroken after the murders, and actually his testimony is like the first time he's ever spoken out publicly about the murders, and he recounted the moment he learned about the deaths. He said that Alec had called him that night and asked him if he was sitting down. He said that he sounded odd and told him that his mother and brother were shot, and he immediately headed to his home and found his father just completely heartbroken and barely able to speak. Defense also brought in an expert witness, a forensic engineer, Mike Sutton, who basically said that the shooter was 5'2", so there was no way that Alec could have done it because he is 6'4". And then I think the real turning point of the case happened on February 23rd, which is when Alec Murdaugh himself took the stand in his own murder trial and had actually confessed that he lied about his alibi on the night of the murders. At the start of his testimony, he right away admitted to lying about not going to the dog kennels, because obviously he was caught, so what else was he going to do? And he immediately blamed his opioid addiction for giving him paranoid thinking, and his distrust in SLED, which together led him to lie to law enforcement agents, family members, and friends on multiple occasions for 20 months. He said on the stand that on June 7th, he wasn't thinking clearly. He doesn't think he was capable of reason. He lied about being down there, and he was very sorry that he did. And then he made mention that the judge kind of threw it back in his face at the end. Oh, what a tangle web we weave. Once I told a lie and I told my family I had to keep lying. And that was the first time that Alec had confessed publicly or to law enforcement that he had lied. And the confession came after jurors had seen Paul's cell phone video, which placed him at the scene, so he literally didn't really even have a choice. While confessing to lying, he continued to insist his innocence on the murders. I did not shoot my wife or my son anytime, ever. He spoke fondly of his wife and son, who he repeatedly referred to as Paw Paw, as he faced jurors head-on and broke down in tears on multiple occasions. He dismissed the significant key parts of the prosecution's case, such as his change in clothing and his alleged attempts to get a story straight with his mother's carrier and his housekeeper. He also confessed to stealing money from his law firm and to orchestrating a bizarre botched hitman plot, but continued to deny killing his wife and son. He blamed his alleged financial crimes on a 20-year opioid addiction, which he said he spent years battling. He claimed he developed his addiction after injuring his knee in college, and his addiction just escalated after that. In a move to undermine the prosecution's theory of motive, he insisted that he was not concerned that his financial crimes were on the brink of exposure on the day of the murders. His law firm was asking questions about missing payments, with his CFO confronting him about the $792,000 on the day of the murders, and a hearing in the 2019 fatal boat crash lawsuit was scheduled for later that week. So he said he wasn't concerned yet. All of this was about to come up. He also tried to dismiss the significance of the voicemail message he sent to the bank CEO 4 days before the murders, and he suggested that the deaths of Maggie and Paul could not have benefited him financially. He insisted that there was $7 million in equity in the Moselle home and that the home was fully in Maggie's name. The entire Moselle property was 100% in Maggie's name. So her death actually made it more difficult to access his finances, which I don't know if that's true, actually. Anyway, in terms of the botched hitman plot, he told the court that he believed it would be better for him to just be dead. I want to know why, Alec. Why was it just better for you to be dead? Is it because of the financial issues? Or is it because you killed your wife and son and, whatever? But during a really intense cross-examination about his family's prominence in the Low Country, he snapped, and he confronted the prosecutor, who reeled off a list of real people who had suffered extensive injuries and losses and then were swindled by Murdaugh. He was also told that in one case, Alec had stole $6 million from Hakeem Pickney, a man who became a quadriplegic after a car crash. So literally the prosecution just made him seem worse and worse and worse. It got very heated as Mr. Waters delved into the financial crimes of Alec Murdaugh, repeatedly returning to what the prosecutor said was a rehearsed line. He continued to spar with prosecution over the prominence of the Murdaugh family in Hampton County, and with Murdaugh admitting that people likely saw him as a successful lawyer and that he and his family were prominent in the local legal circles, which we all knew that, which is why they were able to do whatever they could without getting in trouble. He also admitted that he may have used his solicitor's badge to curry favor with law enforcement in the past, including the night of the boat crash. The court was shown a surveillance image of Murdaugh at the hospital while the other teenagers were taken. He was wearing a solicitor's badge hanging out of his pocket in the image. He denied telling the survivors not to cooperate with law enforcement and said he wasn't sure why he had his badge on him, but he may have done so to get a warmer response from the police. So he's denying that he tried to coerce these kids into lying to save Paul. But the jury also learned how he fit blue police lights in his vehicle, even though he was never a member of law enforcement. On February 24th, the continued cross-examination, Murdaugh claimed he can't remember the last conversation he ever had with his wife Maggie and son Paul just minutes before they were gunned down at the family's estate. He was confronted by Mr. Waters about his news story where he admits to being at the kennels with his wife and son. When he asked what he did at the kennels, all Mr. Murdaugh said was he was talking to Mags, yet he was unable to recall what the conversation was. Under further prompting from the prosecutor, Murdaugh said that Maggie was very concerned about Paul, and so he believes that they may have spoken about that. He also said he believes he spoke to Paul, but was not sure what that was about either. So, how convenient. Cross-examination was really, really, really intense and just a back and forth. But Mr. Waters confronted Mr. Murdaugh on his news story about being at the dog kennels, which came after 20 months of lying to officials, friends, and family. Prosecutor pointed out that this confession only came after jurors saw Paul's cell phone video, which placed him at the scene of the murders with his wife and son at 8:44 p.m., and after multiple witnesses had identified his voice in the footage. Murdaugh denied that he was making up the story and instead sought to blame the prosecution for his lies, rumbling on until his trial testimony, claiming that he tried to tell the truth, but that the state would not speak to him. In a really big, dramatic moment laced with a lot of objections from the defense. Mr. Waters pointed out that Murdaugh's own attorneys were not apparently aware of his change in story either. Jurors heard how at the time when Murdaugh claimed he wanted to come clean, his attorneys did a national TV interview in November of last year, repeating his own lies about his alibi. In another moment, Murdaugh insisted that there was no one else in the vicinity of the kennels when he was there, or the family's dogs would have reacted. Pressed about the specific time he left, Murdaugh estimated that he likely left around 8:47 p.m. With the drive back up to the house in the golf cart taking a couple of minutes, Mr. Waters pointed out that he would have gotten there around 8:49 p.m. Data indicates that Maggie and Paul last used their cell phones at 8:49 p.m. and were shot dead around 8:50. Alec testified that he didn't hear any gunshots after arriving back at the house. He was grilled about his cell phone data, which did not record any steps between 8:09 and 9:02. Alec claimed that he must have left his phone at the house while at the kennels, though he claims that he might have been back around 12 minutes by that point. In the 4 minutes between 9:02 and 9:06, Murdaugh's cell phone then recorded 283 steps, a movement that Alec struggled to explain other than that he was getting ready to go to his mother's house. I know this is a really long episode, so I'm getting there. Alec was continually grilled about discrepancies around when he allegedly touched the bloody bodies of his wife and son. During direct questioning, Alec again claimed that he touched both victims, but appeared to change his timing than what he said with the 911 dispatcher. Mr. Waters confronted him about this, saying that he had repeatedly told law enforcement that he had touched both Maggie and Paul prior to the 911 call. And he said, "I know I checked them, but I don't think I checked them before calling 911. However, in the 911 call, Murdaugh did say that he already touched them, but it's unclear if this was earlier in the call or prior to the call being placed or whatever. Mr. Waters suggested that this was just another attempt for Murdaugh to amend his story to try and fit into the evidence already stacked against him. The data from the SUV also previously revealed that less than 20 seconds passed between his car arriving at the scene and him placing the 911 call. So, again, no way that he could have touched the bodies within that 20 seconds. Murdaugh also claimed that he still believes his wife and son were murdered by an unknown assailant because of the boat crash in 2019. He said that the social media response was really vile after everything, and that things were said about what they want to do to Paw Paw, and they were just very over the top, but they never took anything too seriously. He said, "I believe then and I believe today that the wrong person saw and read that, because I can tell you for a fact that the person or people who did what I saw on June 7th, they hated Paul Murdaugh and they had anger in their heart." And then he broke down in tears again. So the prosecutor scoffed at that theory, saying that, the chances of it being a random vigilante. And, once again, defense tried to bring up that it might have been because the shooter was most likely 5'2", based on their expert witness. But prosecutors did point out there was no evidence to support the accused, the defense's theory. So after long cross-examination, another bombshell moment unfolded when Murdaugh was accused of lying on the stand about why he had lied over his alibi on the night of the murders. Murdaugh had testified that he had lied for the past 20 months because he was paranoid over his suspicions of SLED. Warnings from his law firm partners about always have a lawyer present when speaking to the police, and investigators having swabbed his hands for gunshot residue. But in a dramatic moment, Mr. Waters poured cold water on his testimony as he played a clip from body cam footage from the first officer to respond to the scene. In the video, Daniel Green asked Murdaugh when he last saw Maggie and Paul, and he said, "Earlier tonight. I don't know the exact time. I was probably gone about an hour and a half to my mom's, and I saw them about 45 minutes before that." Mr. Waters pointed out that none of those factors Murdaugh claimed prompted his paranoid-fueled lies at the time. So he basically said that he's lying on the stand too, and Murdaugh disagreed. Defense also had two expert witnesses come up and say that Paul was most likely shot in the back of the head, um, based on, I guess, how everything was. But that, again, goes against what was said on the other side, where they said that Paul was facing his killer. So there is two different points of view. Expert witnesses say back, expert witnesses on the other side say he was facing him. So, again, what do normal people know? You believe experts, but when you have three different experts saying different things, it is hard to know that. Alec's younger brother, John Marvin Murdaugh, was called up to the stand. He mentioned that he had a really special relationship with his nephew who was killed, and that he had gone down to the dog kennels on June 8th and could see Paul's blood and brain matter and pieces of his skull left all over the feed room. So he actually was cleaning up what he said was what was left of Paul, and it was just extremely hard. And he promised Paul at that time that he would find out who did this to him. And it's something he hasn't done yet because he doesn't think his brother did it. And also mentioned that his brother had a great relationship with his wife and son. Also, going back into the lack of cleanup and just how badly SLED handled the crime scene, John Marvin gave other testimony, being very critical of the investigation, and included what he described as a baffling statement released by law enforcement, an apparent lack of urgency to locate Maggie's cell phone, and evidence law enforcement shared with him that turned out to be inaccurate. He testified that he met with investigators a lot over the course of the investigation and had been shown evidence that officials had connecting his brother to the murders. He told the court how he later learned that some of the evidence was not accurate. He recalled one day where he was asked about the blue raincoat, which had been found during the search of the upstairs bedroom at their parents' home. He said his brother and sister were later shown the coat, and he said that he had never seen it before. However, he said he learned that it had been found in a closet in his parents' home that was typically used to store junk. A SLED agent also told him that they knew his brother was responsible for the murders because of blood spatter evidence found on the white t-shirt he was wearing the night of the murders. However, as we know, there was no blood spatter on that white t-shirt. So, but prosecutors allege that Murdaugh actually changed his clothing during the murders. So again, it is false regardless. During rebuttal, basically, prosecution had Dr. Reimer come back in and basically say how the two forensic experts on the defense side were wrong. And then there was a bunch of other rebuttal witnesses that kind of contradict Alec's testimony himself. So also a crime scene expert basically throws the 5.2 shooter out the window, and again talked about Paul's injuries, and that was pretty much it. And then obviously there was closing statements, and then the jury deliberated. Now, what's interesting about this whole case in terms of the jury is the jury was not allowed to have any notebooks or anything to write down but everything was in the jury room. So when hearing talks from some of the jury members who did go on the news after everything went down, they did say that, a lot of jury members would go into the jury room during breaks or at the end of the day and just write down certain things so that they can, or certain questions so that they can all talk about it when they came back. So jury deliberations started, and in less than 3 hours later, they returned back with a guilty verdict. Outside the courtroom, prosecutors were greeted to cheering crowds over the verdict response. And then the next day, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. And then he still kind of has to deal with all of the financial stuff. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy. There was a point in the trial where the jury was brought to the estate to kind of see things. And I know some of the jurors that again talked to the news after the trial said that that actually helped them a lot because Alec Murdaugh made mention that he had left and gone back to the house. He didn't hear gunshots or anything. And the one juror said that she saw how close the house was to the kennels. Like, there's no way with the amount of shots, especially shotgun shots and stuff like that, that he would not have heard the murders happening. So they also made mention that they thought Alec getting up on the stand was probably the worst thing for him to do because it actually hurt him more than help him. So they thought that was a big mistake. I'm sure Alec Murdaugh is going to appeal, and we'll see what happens with that. But as of right now, he is a convicted murderer and is sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder of his wife Maggie and son Paul. So there you go. That's it. That's all there is. Again, I am so sorry for how long this episode is, but it was a lot of information. The whole trial lasted about 6 weeks or so, and it was just crazy. March 2nd was when the verdict came out, and again, less than 3 hours. And I just remember I was nervous because it was either going to be a hung jury or he was going to be guilty. I really didn't think he was ever going to be innocent necessarily, but it worked out, and there is some justice for Paul and Maggie. I know Mallory Beach's family is still going ahead to go after the Murdaugh family. So we'll see kind of what happens with that. If I learn more as things get going, of course, I'll try and come back with that information. But for now, that's it for the Murdaugh murder trial. So thank you so much for listening, guys, and we'll talk soon.